A defiant President Trump is pressing ahead with a new round of tariffs today after really a devastating ruling from the Supreme Court that determined his sweeping emergency trade duties are illegal. This morning, the president announcing on social media that he's raising worldwide tariffs to 15% after signing a 10% global tariff order late Friday. And today, the president continues to lash out at the Supreme Court, calling its 6-3 court decision on his signature economic policy extraordinarily anti-American.
At 9:42 a.m., on a Monday that was supposed to mark a victory for the rule of law, a single social media post threatened to override the authority of the United States Supreme Court. Not a press conference, not a formal address, just a post. And in the time it takes to read one paragraph, the world's most powerful man had declared war on his own country's highest legal institution. This is not a political story. This is a constitutional story. And what happens in the next 150 days may redefine the limits of presidential power for the next 100 years. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the history, not the backstory, just the moment everything broke open. The Supreme Court of the United States had just handed down one of the most consequential trade rulings in modern American history. In a 6-3 decision, the majority declared that President Trump's sweeping global tariffs were illegal. Not controversial, not debatable, illegal, the court said the president did not have the unilateral authority to impose those duties in the broad, sweeping way he had done, without proper congressional oversight. Game over, or so the world thought. But here's where the story stops being predictable.
I want to pull up his social media post for you now. In it, he said, in part, I, as President of the United States of America, will be effective immediately, raising the 10% worldwide tariff on countries, many of which have been ripping the U.S. off for decades without retribution until I came along to the fully allowed and legally tested 15% level.
Within 24 hours, President Trump didn't retreat. He didn't pause. He didn't call Congress. He posted. And what he posted didn't just reinstate the tariffs the court had struck down. He raised them from 10% to 15%, effective immediately. The language he used told you everything. Fully allowed and legally tested. That phrase alone should stop you in your tracks, because it's either a stroke of legal genius or the beginning of the most explosive constitutional standoff this country has seen in a generation. All of this, every fact, every figure, every analysis you just heard, comes from public data and historical record. This is my independent take. You are completely free to form your own conclusions. Nothing here is meant to spread hate or division. The only goal is to help you see clearly what is actually happening in the world right now and what it means for all of us. Now, before you dismiss this as just another political fight, understand what's actually at stake. This isn't about percentages on price tags. This is about a fundamental question. Who controls American economic policy? The president, the Congress, or the courts? That question has been simmering in legal and academic circles for decades. But right now, it's not theoretical. It's real. It's happening. And the answer will affect the cost of everything you buy, every business that imports goods, every relationship America has with every trading partner on earth. Let's put a number on it.
Are you surprised in particular by their decision today, and do you regret nominating them?
I don't want to say whether or not I regret. I think their decision was terrible. Yeah. I think it's an embarrassment to their families. You want to know the truth, the two of them.
It was a threat to our existence, and so we had to pursue this, and to have the court stand with us that in our contention that it was an unlawful tax, and to also to reinforce the rule of law meant a lot to us. We're proud of this. It's very difficult to assign us the task of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again when the government shoved him off the top of the wall. So I'm not sure how we do that. The approach that we've taken when considering this equitable question is to return our prices as quickly as we can to where they would have been.
Because numbers matter here. The United States imports roughly $3 trillion worth of goods every year. A 15% tariff, applied globally, doesn't hit all of that, but it hits enough. Economists estimate the direct cost of broad tariff regimes like this can run into hundreds of billions of dollars annually. Some of that gets paid by foreign exporters, who lower their prices to stay competitive. Some of it gets paid by American importers, who absorb the cost to protect market share. And some of it, a growing, undeniable portion of it, gets paid by American consumers, at the checkout, on the price tag, in the monthly budget of every family in this country. This is not abstract. This is not theoretical. This is arithmetic. And the arithmetic is getting worse. Here's what made the Supreme Court ruling so devastating for the administration. It wasn't the liberals. It was the coalition. Chief Justice John Roberts joined with the 3 liberal justices, yes, but the 6-3 majority also included Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Neil Gorsuch, 2 of Trump's own nominees, 2 people he personally elevated to the nation's highest court, 2 people who, in this moment, voted against the legal foundation of his entire second-term economic strategy. Trump's reaction was not measured. It was not diplomatic. It was personal. He called the decision extraordinarily anti-American. He stood in front of cameras at the White House. He said he was deeply disappointed. And then he said something you almost never hear a sitting president say about justices he appointed. He said he was ashamed of them. A reporter asked him point blank, "Do you regret nominating them?" He didn't say no. He said their decision was terrible. He said it was an embarrassment to their families. Let that land for a moment. A president is speaking publicly in saying a Supreme Court ruling is an embarrassment to the justices' families. That's not political hyperbole. That's a signal. That's a man who believes the judicial branch just made a catastrophic mistake and who has no intention of simply accepting it. And yet, and this is critical, he also singled out Justice Brett Kavanaugh, who dissented. He called him his new hero on the Supreme Court. He said the dissenting justices truly believed they could, in his words, make America great again. He used his own campaign slogan to describe what he saw as loyal judicial thinking. The implication was clear. In Trump's framework, the court isn't just a legal body, it's a political ally, or an obstacle. And right now, it's an obstacle. So what does a man with that worldview do when the Supreme Court blocks his economic agenda? He finds a different law, and that's exactly what happened. Enter Section 122. Think of Section 122 as an emergency brake built into the trade law system, something designed for short-term corrections, not long-term strategy. It gives the president the authority to impose temporary tariff adjustments in response to a balance of payments crisis without immediately needing a congressional vote. And the key word is temporary, up to 150 days. After that, Congress has to step in for anything permanent. Now, most people have never heard of Section 122, and that's exactly the point. It's an obscure provision. It's buried deep in trade law. It was never designed to be a weapon, but in the hands of an administration that just lost at the Supreme Court, it became one within 24 hours. That tells you something important, not about this tariff specifically, but about the broader strategy. When one door closes, this administration does not knock on another door. It finds a window, it finds a tunnel, it finds something that nobody thought to lock, and that's not incompetence, that's preparation. The question, the one legal scholars are losing sleep over right now, is whether preparation is the same thing as compliance. Finding a legal tool is not the same as using it legally, and that distinction will matter enormously in the months ahead. So here's what just happened. In plain terms, the Supreme Court said the old tariff mechanism was illegal. The administration looked at the legal toolkit, found a different mechanism, and announced a 15% global tariff under that new authority before the ink on the ruling was even dry. Whether that move will survive its own legal challenge is a question being debated right now in law schools, newsrooms, and trading floors around the world. But here's the uncomfortable reality. It gives the president a window, a 150-day window, where these tariffs can exist, where economic pressure can be applied, and where negotiations can be forced, all while the legal machinery slowly grinds toward another potential ruling. That's not chaos, that's strategy. Aggressive, constitutionally aggressive strategy, but strategy nonetheless. Now, you might be wondering, what exactly is the legal argument? How can the president claim a 15% tariff is fully allowed and legally tested when the court just struck down his previous tariffs? The White House framing is straightforward. The previous ruling addressed a specific mechanism under a specific statutory authority. Section 122 is a different tool with different legal parameters, and the administration believes it clears the bar. Legal experts and White House correspondents are still seeking clarification on how the timelines for the 10 and 15% rates overlap, and whether Section 122's balance of payments justification will hold up. But the clock is already ticking. And while Washington argues law, the rest of the world is watching something far more immediate, the collapse of economic certainty. When the Supreme Court first ruled, there was something close to relief in European capitals. France, Germany, the UK. They had all been living under the shadow of these tariffs, trying to negotiate, trying to adapt. The court ruling felt like a pressure valve releasing. French President Emmanuel Macron acknowledged it publicly, saying international trade must be based on reciprocity, not unilateral decisions. The European Commission, measured as always, called for stability and predictability in trade policy. And then, 24 hours later, the 15% announcement landed. And that relief evaporated, because what the world realized in that moment is that the legal victory at the Supreme Court did not actually change the economic reality on the ground. The tariffs were still there. They were higher. and the mechanism used to reimpose them was new enough that it couldn't be immediately challenged in the same way. Europe was back to square one, except now, with less faith that the legal system would provide a durable answer. And there's something deeper happening here, something that goes beyond this specific tariff fight. The world has been trying to predict American trade policy by watching American institutions. If the courts say stop, trade will stabilize. If Congress pushes back, there will be a negotiation. If the president backs down, markets will recover. That was the playbook. That was how governments, finance ministers, and CEOs were building their contingency plans. But what happens when none of those assumptions hold? What happens when a court ruling doesn't stop the tariffs? It just changes the legal label on them. What happens when the institution everyone counted on to provide certainty becomes a speed bump instead of a stop sign? That's the crisis that no one in Brussels or Seoul or Tokyo fully prepared for. And it's not just about money, it's about trust. The credibility of American institutions, their predictability, their finality, is a form of global currency. When that currency loses value, every trading relationship gets more expensive. Every contract gets harder to write. Every investment decision gets harder to justify. That's the invisible cost of what happened this week. And it won't show up on any price tag, but it will show up eventually in every economy connected to this one. In Asia, the concern is even more pointed. South Korea and New Zealand issued cautious statements, acknowledging that trade policy uncertainty would likely persist. But the real nerve center of this entire tariff strategy isn't Europe, it's Taiwan, and specifically, it's semiconductors. President Trump has been extraordinarily direct about this. During his White House press conference, he accused Taiwan of, in his words, stealing the American chip business. He said Taiwan came in and took something that belonged to the United States, and that the tariffs are the mechanism for getting it back. The narrative he's selling is simple. We built the intellectual foundation of the semiconductor industry. Other countries industrialized it, profited from it, and left American manufacturing behind. The tariffs, in this framing, aren't punishment. They're leverage. And here's what makes that argument harder to dismiss than critics would like. It's working, at least partially. For the first time in decades, U.S. imports from Taiwan have overtaken those from China. Companies that had built their supply chains around Taiwanese manufacturing are now announcing factory build-outs in Arizona and Texas, specifically citing the desire to avoid tariff exposure. Trump pointed to this in his press conference, not as a future ambition, but as a present reality. They're all pouring into the United States, he said. This isn't a chip war, it's a sovereignty play. The administration's argument is that allowing foreign countries to dominate semiconductor manufacturing creates a national security vulnerability that no amount of free trade theory can justify. And when you frame tariffs as a national security tool rather than an economic one, the legal landscape shifts considerably. The challenge is that national security arguments, when used to justify broad economic policies, have historically faced serious scrutiny from the courts. Scrutiny that is now, with 15% tariffs in effect, very much on its way. Taiwan's government is watching all of this closely, and with a meeting between Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping scheduled in Beijing next month, every percentage point of tariff policy carries diplomatic weight. That extends far beyond price tags. But let's be honest about something. Because all of this, the constitutional drama, the geopolitical chess, the semiconductor sovereignty argument, it's real. But it's also abstract. And the people who are paying the most immediate price for it are not heads of state. They're not legal scholars. They're small business owners in cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles who are staring at invoices that don't make sense anymore. Let me give you a concrete picture. A majority of shoes sold in the United States are imported. China, Vietnam, Indonesia, these are the primary sources. For an independent shoe retailer in Manhattan, someone running 1 or 2 locations, competing against big box giants and online behemoths, these tariffs aren't an abstract policy debate. They're existential. A shoe that retailed for $120 before the tariffs now needs to be priced closer to $145, even $150 just to maintain margin. That's not a minor adjustment. That's the difference between a customer completing a purchase and walking out to find it cheaper online. Some business owners have tried to absorb the costs, holding prices steady to keep customers coming back, but you can only absorb so much before the math stops working. And what makes it worse is the uncertainty. Because you can't plan around uncertainty. You can't place orders 6 months in advance when you don't know what the tariff rate will be when those containers arrive. You can't negotiate supplier contracts when you don't know if the legal landscape will have changed by the time the goods hit port. Boxes are sitting in warehouses, waiting for a decision that hasn't come yet. Inventory is piling up, margins are shrinking, and answers are nowhere to be found. Think about what that actually looks like, day to day. A small clothing importer in Los Angeles placed her orders in January. The goods shipped from Vietnam in February. They're sitting on a container ship right now, somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, and she has no idea what the tariff rate will be when that ship pulls into port. Will it be 10%? 15%? Will there be a new legal challenge that changes everything again before the container even clears customs? She can't answer that question. Her supplier can't answer that question. Her bank, which is financing the inventory audit, can't answer that question. So she waits. And while she waits, her competitors keep moving. The big retailers with legal teams and lobbyists, they have contingency plans for every scenario. She has a spreadsheet and a prayer. That is the real-world texture of this crisis. Not the Supreme Court chambers, not the White House podium. A woman in Los Angeles staring at a shipping tracker, trying to calculate whether she's going to make payroll next month. One CEO, who was among the plaintiffs in the original lawsuit against the Trump administration, a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court and won, described the tariffs as a threat to our existence. Think about that for a moment. His company went to court. They made the legal argument. They prevailed. And yet, even after winning at the highest level, his business is left with seven-figure legal fees, a damaged market, and a new tariff rate that just went from 10 to 15% under a different legal mechanism, he put it simply. It's very difficult to assign us the task of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again when the government shoved them off the top of the wall. That line deserves to be heard because it captures something that no legal ruling or policy briefing can fully convey, the cost of uncertainty borne by the people least equipped to absorb it. These aren't corporations with legal teams and lobbying budgets. These are business owners who made bets on stability and are now paying for someone else's war, and the war is about to go public in the most dramatic possible way. This Tuesday, President Trump is scheduled to deliver his State of the Union address to a joint session of Congress. By tradition, the Supreme Court justices attend. They sit in the front rows. And this particular year, the president who called their ruling extraordinarily anti-American, who said they embarrassed their families, who raised tariffs in direct defiance of their decision, will stand at the podium and look directly at them. Imagine being Justice Amy Coney Barrett in that moment. Imagine being Justice Neil Gorsuch. You were nominated by this man. You were elevated by this man. You voted your conscience, and he called it an embarrassment to your family on national television. And now you're sitting in the front row while he delivers his vision for the country, a vision that, by his own account, requires the executive branch to operate with a degree of economic unilateralism that your vote just said was illegal. The cameras will be watching. The body language will tell a story that no speechwriter can control. And whatever the president says about tariffs, about trade, about China and Taiwan and the 15% rate, he'll be saying it to the very people who just told him he went too far. This is not a footnote. This is a moment, and it may be one of the most uncomfortable moments in the modern history of the State of the Union. Think about what that room will feel like. 535 members of Congress, the cabinet, the Joint Chiefs, hundreds of millions of Americans watching at home. And in the front row, the 9 justices of the Supreme Court, including 2 people who just handed the president the most significant legal defeat of his second term. There are no scripts for that moment. There is no protocol that makes it comfortable. The president will speak, the justices will sit, and the tension between those 2 facts will be visible to everyone watching. Some will cheer, some will stay silent, and the justices, by tradition, do not applaud. They do not react. They sit in their robes and they project neutrality. But neutrality is hard. When the man at the podium just called your decision an embarrassment to your family, neutrality is hard. When you know that the ruling you issued in good conscience has been bypassed by a different legal mechanism, before your opinion was even a week old, that's the moment that's coming. And it will tell us something, not just about this president and this court, but about the durability of the institutions themselves. And it's a moment that crystallizes the central tension of this entire episode. What happens when the executive branch believes the judicial branch is wrong, not just inconveniently, but catastrophically, anti-nationally wrong? The 150-day clock under Section 122 is ticking. In that window, Congress could act. Though Congress acting on trade policy at this speed, in this environment, would be genuinely historic. The courts could rule Section 122's use unconstitutional in this context, another legal battle that would take months, or the administration could negotiate enough trade deals with enough countries to make the tariff question politically moot before any legal resolution arrives. That's the play. Force the world to the table. Use the 150 days as leverage. Arrive at bilateral agreements that make the tariff architecture look less like an illegal overreach and more like a successful strategy. Whether that play works depends on too many variables to predict, but here's what we do know. 3 things are now in motion simultaneously, and they are moving at very different speeds. The legal system moves slowly. A challenge to Section 122, and if it comes, will take months to work through the courts, maybe longer. The political system moves unpredictably. Congress could act, but Congress has been paralyzed on trade for years. Getting a bipartisan majority to override or ratify anything in this environment would require a level of coordination that Washington hasn't managed in a long time. And the economic system moves fast. Businesses make decisions today. Supply chains shift this quarter. Prices change this week. So while the lawyers argue and the politicians debate, the economic reality is already locking in. Companies are already rerouting supply chains. Some are already moving production. Some are already raising prices. Some are already cutting staff, and once those decisions are made, they don't reverse easily. You don't move a factory back because a court ruled in your favor. You don't rehire the workers you let go because a judge issued an injunction. The economic consequences of legal uncertainty outlast the legal uncertainty itself. That's the part of this story that gets lost. In the headlines about Section 122 and the Supreme Court, the law will eventually settle. The court battles will eventually end. The 150 days will eventually expire. But the damage to supply chains, the damage to business confidence, the damage to the relationships between American importers and their foreign partners, that damage is accumulating right now, every single day. And the longer the uncertainty lasts, the harder it becomes to put back together. What we can say with certainty is this. The rules of the game have changed. The executive branch has now demonstrated a willingness and a capacity to find new legal mechanisms within hours of a Supreme Court ruling. The judicial branch has shown it will hold the line on constitutional limits, even when it means ruling against its own nominees. And the rest of the world, every trading partner, every factory, every small business importing goods into the United States is navigating all of this without a map. Before this script ends, one thing worth stating clearly. Every piece of analysis here draws from public data, historical context, and independent assessment. You are absolutely free to reach your own conclusions. This is not advocacy for any political position. It is an attempt to lay out what happened, what the mechanisms mean, and what the stakes are, so that you can think it through for yourself. Because here is the question that none of us can escape. It is no longer whether tariff rates will go up or down. That question has been overtaken by a larger one. The question now is whether constitutional limits still function as a meaningful brake on executive power when economic conviction is strong enough, when political will is unrelenting enough, and when the machinery of alternative legal justifications is sophisticated enough to keep finding new paths forward. That question doesn't have a simple answer, and it won't be resolved in a single ruling or a single address to Congress or a single meeting in Beijing, but it is being answered right now in real time. And here's the thing about answers that come in real time. They often look like chaos before they look like history. In 1952, President Truman seized American steel mills during the Korean War. He said it was a national security necessity. The Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional. Truman complied. That moment became a landmark, a line in the sand, a precedent that said, even in crisis, even with lives on the line, the president does not get to act unilaterally without legal authority. We may be watching a new version of that moment right now. Not because the circumstances are identical, they're not. Trade policy and wartime seizures are very different things, but because the structural question is the same. When does presidential conviction override legal constraint? When does the certainty that you are right justify the decision to act, even when the courts say you're wrong? Truman thought he was right too, and history, in some ways, agreed with him on the stakes. But the court said the method was illegal, and the method matters. Because if the method doesn't matter, if results justify any mechanism, then the Constitution isn't a document of limits. It's a suggestion. And that is the conversation this country is now having, whether it wants to or not, in ways that will shape American law, American trade, and American democracy for decades to come. If you want to understand the world you're actually living in, not the simplified version, not the partisan version, this is the story you need to be following. Subscribe. Hit the notification bell, because the next development in this case is not months away. It could be days, and when it comes, you want to be ready to understand it. The clock is ticking, and nobody, not the president, not the court, not the markets, knows exactly how this ends.